Okay, it's exactly 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and as promised, we'll get started right on time. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. My name is Danny Lamoureux, and I'm Director of Club Development for Curling Canada. And on behalf of our association and our 14 member associations across Canada, very pleased to have you join us tonight on this live webinar discussing this fascinating and complex topic of vaccination passports. And I also want to take this time now, it's been a difficult 16, 18 months for everybody. I just want to thank everybody that's on the call tonight for what you do for the sport of curling and in all the communities across Canada. We really appreciate all the work and effort that goes on in curling clubs across the country. Before we get started, I just want to walk through a few of the webinar etiquette and some follow-up promises that we made to you. We'll just go over those again. And everybody's muted, so that's great. Thank you very much. But please stay muted throughout the call unless we ask you to unmute to ask a live question. Mr. Indig has been provided all of the questions that have been submitted. I think there were 28 different questions. But any additional questions that you may want to ask during this webinar, there's a chat button at the bottom. Just type in your question in the chat room in French or English, and we will ask the question to Mr. Indig and translate the answer if required. Obviously, the webinar is being recorded. We started recording it 15 minutes early, so we're gonna have to do some editing tomorrow. But we're hoping to have the final version to you no later than this Friday, hopefully sooner, as well as all the questions that have been submitted, all the questions that will be asked tonight will be answered in a Word document and sent to and translated into French and sent to everybody again later this week. So let's get ready to go. And just a couple of words. We're moving out of COVID lockdowns, and curling clubs are now starting to plan for hopefully a full season of club play and no more lockdowns. But there's been much talk about vaccination passports, and it's the top lead story in every newscast in the last couple of days, so it's very topical. But curling clubs are asking whether members, customers, users, renters should be fully vaccinated before they're allowed to come in the building to use the services. And to assist all our curling clubs in making this decision, it's now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Steven Indig, lawyer and partner at Sport Law. Sport Law's been working with Curling Canada and other member associations for more than a decade now, and they're a valued partner of our organization. Steve will present and discuss Curling Canada's potential opinion on vaccination passports, as well as deal with the multiple legal issues that might surround any decision that you have to make. If we're ready to go, over to you, Mr. Indig.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Danny, for having me. Always a pleasure to continue to work with curling. I think, Danny, it's been more like 20 years, but we will age both of us by actually saying that that number. For those of you who aren't familiar with Sport Law, we were formerly the Sport Law and Strategy Group and just recently simplified our name, and we provide consulting services across the sport community within Canada. I've had the ability to practice sport law for close to 20 years with about 1,000 different sport organizations across the country, from very small to very large and everybody in between. We have expanded our group extensively over the last 10 years to 16 people now, and each individual that we bring into the association has a different skill set. We have, again, tried to create a bit of a one-stop shop for amateur sport. If you've never been to our website, I will post my contact information at the end of the presentation. It's very simple. It's sportlaw.ca. There are over 400 to 500 articles related to sport, and particularly on COVID as well. Excuse me. So please take advantage of those free resources that are available to you. If there is a question or concern that you have that you don't feel comfortable discussing with 32 people, by all means, I'm happy to have a one-on-one conversation with any of you as necessary to help figure out this really challenging and confusing topic, particularly, or any other matter or any other topic. So please feel free to reach out to do that. I'll just get right into it. For those of you who are asking about the presentation, by all means, of course, you can have it. I will send it to Danny to distribute after the presentation is over. So what do we want to do today? I want to talk about vaccination trends in the industry, trying to understanding the law about how this really simple yet complicated answer, and then what does it really look like when we try or can we mandate vaccines? As Danny said, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. He'll interrupt me as appropriate to answer questions, and we have lots of time tonight to get through the presentation and answer your questions. And if we don't, we do promise already to reply in writing as Danny's indicated. So some of the trends in mandatory vaccinations across the industry, of course, it would be really, really, really simple if the government, particularly the federal government, just set the rules for us. Yet they have unequivocally come out and said, we will not be providing guidance on vaccination passports or the requirements for double vaccination. So that's something that we will likely not see coming from the federal government. We are seeing different trends in the industry. Manitoba just announced it would provide immunization cards to people who are fully vaccinated so they can travel domestically and not required to self-isolate when they return. A lot of universities, particularly Western, just announced it would require all students living in residence to show proof of immunization. Quebec has began issuing downloadable QR codes that show proof of vaccination for limited non-essential services. So they're talking about bars, gyms, restaurants, contact sports, only if the COVID situation worsens in Quebec. And they're looking at a possible implementation date of this requirement for September 1st. They've yet to say it's going to be mandated or that it's going to be implemented. It has been something that has been spoken about. Saskatchewan just announced it would not require vaccinations for residents looking to return to work or attend events because they felt it was a violation of health information and violation of their Health Information Protection Act. So the really simple question is, can we mandate vaccines or require double vaccinations or proof of vaccinations? The simple answer to that is maybe. And I wish it was far more simple than that. But you'll see as we walk through the different legal tests how complicated this is and how much homework curling has to do in order to make this decision to support it when we talk about the legal implications. One of the important factors, of course, is the human rights legislation, which we'll speak about, as well as privacy, health information. Just recently, Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial privacy commissions issued a joint statement warning that vaccine passports may offer substantial public benefit, but it is an encroachment on civil liberties that should be only taken after careful consideration. And I'm going to walk you through what I think that careful consideration is to help you make an informed decision. At the end of the day, are vaccinations, are we allowed to ask for mandatory vaccinations? I joke about saying maybe, but I will say the answer is yes. But it's not a black and white yes. It's a yes with a lot of maybes and a lot of justifications that we will have to be able to prove should we be called to task on it. So I want you to start putting your answer together as if you were standing in front of a human rights tribunal to say why you mandated double vaccination, why you prevented unvaccinated participants or members from playing. Why did you ask for personal health information? And if I don't have an answer to those questions, then I haven't done the due diligence to create a proper answer to protect myself from legal liability related to these type of queries. So let's start with the human rights legislation. So I think that's more complicated than necessarily the privacy. So what is the definition of discrimination? It's to make a distinction, to recognize differences, and to provide prejudicial treatment of a person or a group of people based on certain characteristics. We are treating people differently because of a particular ground that's protected by the Human Rights Code. Now, The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom at section 15 says every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and benefit of law without discrimination, regardless of religion, regardless of color, regardless of gender identity, etc., etc. But what's very important, I'm going to ask this and say this rhetorically, how many curling clubs are subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And the answer to that is probably none of you. The Charter applies to government action, corporations that are mandated by government statute, public schools, municipal sport and recreation programs that are owned by the government. Private schools, private clubs, other privately owned business are not part of government action, and that's not subject to the Charter. A lot of times what happens in my world, and I'm sure a lot of you have faced these questions before, you can't do that. It's against the law. Well, my question always back is, which one? Because it's very important to recognize whether the law is actually applicable to your club and in what particular setting. So when people start quoting about the Charter, yes, that's true when we talk about the access of unemployment insurance or the right to attend schools or libraries, but not private clubs. And even though some of you might be deemed not-for-profit corporations, you are still not a matter of government action. So it's very, very unlikely the Charter applies to you, which is kind of good news. But the bad news is provincial and territorial human rights legislation will apply. Now, what I have before you here is what's written in the Ontario Human Rights Code. I can almost guarantee you that across this country, you will see almost word for word within each provincial and territorial human rights legislation. So you can see the same kind of language is being described here. It is discriminatory practice in the provision of goods and services. They must be generally available to the public, and it's illegal to deny those services or to differentiate a person based on a prohibited ground. An organization offering services to and access to programs to the public comes under the jurisdiction of human rights law. Now, if you are a private club, members-based private club, but basically I want to draw a distinction. If your private club is open to anybody who pays the $500 membership fee, you're not really a private club. You're a public club that allows people to come into it. A truly private club would have distinctions on the eligibility requirements available to people. And you do have the ability to discriminate if there's bona fide reason to do so, and you treat everybody within that group the same way. So even though you might be deemed a private club, it doesn't give you carte blanche to mandate double vaccinations to access the club, as you have to treat everybody the same within the organization. So when we look at the human rights legislation that says, hey, you can't treat us different based on prohibited grounds, well, what are those prohibited grounds? Race, place of origin, ethnic origin, creed, sexual orientation, ancestry, citizenship. You can see the long list. Now, where this comes into play when we talk about vaccinations is likely creed, which means religious beliefs, as well as disability. I can't and choose not to get vaccinated because I have a medical issue that will not be beneficial to me. I will not receive that vaccination because my religious beliefs do not allow for it. And these are the concerns that we have to be aware of. So a simple black and white, yes, you must be doubly vaccinated to access our club, it's not that solidified. Hi, Danny, I can't get a double vaccination. It's against my religion. When you get approached with that query, you stop. You say, please supply me as much information as you can about your request for what we call accommodation. Please do not say, too bad. Stop, get information, assess, because in law, everything is not black and white, and there may be situations to which we are obligated to accommodate. And what does accommodation look like? Again, may depend on the circumstances. I'll give you some pointers at the end of the presentations about what my personal opinion is on double vaccinations, but I do want to walk through the legal test. So again, yes, you can create a rule, but you have to be open to amend that rule based on prohibited grounds. And particularly the hot topics in vaccinations is religion and disability or medical issue. So when we're before a human rights tribunal, there'll be a legal test. Are we treating people differently? And the answer is yes. We are saying to people who are doubly vaccinated, come, play curling. You're more than welcome. And those of you who are not, you are not welcome here. Or you may be welcome in a particular time set. Is that discrimination based on a prohibited ground? So those people who are anti-maskers, who believe COVID doesn't exist, who just simply do not want to get the COVID vaccination, that is not protected by a prohibited ground. We are only concerned about people who are protected by that religious belief or medical issue. And some of you may be reading the newspapers these days. I don't. There might be a new term. I don't know if newspapers exist anymore. The news. And you can see what's happening, for argument's sake, in the NFL. They have started to indicate that coaches and staff who are not doubly vaccinated will not have access to the players. And the players who have no interest in getting a vaccination are being treated differently. They're eating in different rooms. They're training in different rooms. They have to be tested prior to practice, prior to a game, and the protocols are different. Now, because they're not protected by a prohibited ground, we don't have to accommodate. We don't have to accommodate. But those who are protected, we have an obligation to look for accommodation, or we need bona fide justification. Is there evidence to suggest that we cannot provide this service? And of course, the simple answer to that is health and safety. And again, I say this rhetorically because I don't think the answer exists yet. What is the COVID contagious rate in a curling rink? And I don't think we know the answer to that. And are there other ways to which we can curl without mandating double vaccinations? And I think we've been doing it for the most part the last 18 months. Yes, the game has changed a little bit. Yes, there's mandatory social distancing. Yes, there's mandatory mask wearing. So it is possible that we may be able to still provide the service without going to the extreme of double vaccinated or not. So that bona fide evidence is what we're looking for if we're going to be creating that safety argument. Is what's the evidence to support it? What's the infectious rate, the contagious rate in an ice rink, in a curling rink, in close contact? And if we don't have that answer, we have an obligation to accommodate. And to be quite blunt, we've been accommodating for the last 18 months. We do declarations, we do waivers, we do questionnaires, we do minimize the number of people in a club. We do all of these things. So hence you can see it's not as black and white to simply say double vaccinated or you're in. If they have a prohibited ground which requires a bona fide justification to deny the service or an accommodation. And that's why I said to you, when you get the question of, do I have to be double vaccinated or I choose not to be, your answer should be thank you. Provide as much information as you can, and we will get back to you on what those next steps are. Simply saying no may lead you to a human rights complaint, a privacy complaint. And again, I want you to be able to tell your story. So when you're standing in front of a judge, and I hope you never are, that there makes sense on the decision that you've implemented. So what are some of the issues of go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in. I got a few comments here that I think are appropriate. There's actually the first comment we'll wait until we discuss waivers. But there's a comment here, and he signed it. He signed his name, so I'm going to say who it is. It's Kendall Wading, General Counsel and Chief Privacy Officer. I'm assuming Alberta. He says this is first off a privacy issue. You have to meet the 4-part test under Alberta privacy law before asking. Then human rights question in Alberta.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will get to the privacy components. And for
Okay.
sure, Kendall, please add in your expertise. That would be fabulous with respect to the privacy concerns. Yeah, absolutely. And
Okay.
we will get to that in a minute.
One other, and I think you answered it. The question is, what if they are just afraid of the vaccination?
Yeah, it's not a protected ground. So again, you don't want it, or you choose not to get it for your own reasons that are not protected by human rights legislation, is not not a reason to which we require accommodation. So we can simply say if they don't want it, they can simply say no. And I'm seeing that happen a lot right now, not necessarily with the double vaccination, but with the mask wearing, where organizations are saying, okay, you have to wear masks here to here, but if you're physically active, you do not have to. And we're seeing some pushback on that, but not because of a prohibited ground, but because people just don't like wearing masks. And that's not a valid reason to change your protocols. So I'll keep going, Danny. Yeah, for jump in anytime.
Yeah, there's one other question there, but we'll get to it just farther down. It's in but waivers.
Yeah, we'll come. That's kind of the question. I know it's in one of the questions we received in advance.
Yeah.
So what's justification to discriminate, to prevent the ability to provide services? One is decency, public morals, prohibiting boys and girls in the same locker room, boys and girls on wrestling teams. And again, the law on this is always changing. We're seeing justification on affirmative action programs, giving people a break or an opportunity to participate in something which they normally may be disadvantaged. And then, of course, there's the safety argument, reasonable justification. You must prove with evidence that it's reasonable. Scientific evidence has to be provided. It can't just be your opinion that this is a safety concern. We might need medical expertise to speak about the contagious effects of COVID in a curling environment. So what's reasonable accommodation? We have an obligation to make accommodation for those groups or individuals if they are denied services based on a prohibited ground. And that's why I'm saying stop, assess, look at the flexibility and how you apply your rules or your procedures, as it may be appropriate to modify them. But we deal with those on a case by case basis. And I reiterate, I've got several clients who have paid tens of thousands of dollars for one sentence. One client, and I don't condone this obviously, told an athlete they were fat and old and they should retire. That cost $15,000 in settlement fees. Had another client tell an individual they have to be in this group because of their age. That cost $12,000. So you have to be really careful about what you say and when. I just recently had a client who had an employee ask their supervisor, when's a good time for me to get pregnant? And of course, the appropriate answer would be whenever you want, and good luck and keep me posted. Yet that individual response was, oh, not you too. Well, that I think cost $9,000 in settlement fees. So you've got to be really careful. And that's why I'm urging all of you to be cautious when you are presented with a request to accommodate or a variance to the rule that you want to implement. So we have legal obligations outside of human rights legislation as well. Organizations owe a duty to their staff and stakeholders to maintain a safe and healthy environment, including an outbreak of infection. They're required to take every reasonable precaution in the circumstances to protect its stakeholders. And there's right now currently no legislation that specifically addresses steps organizations must take to meet this duty in the context of COVID-19. And this goes back to a presentation I did about 50 times between last March and August about creating a safe environment, a return to play in a COVID environment. And I keep talking about telling your stories. When we talk about coming back to curling and allowing your staff and your members and your participants to come back, we still have an obligation to provide a safe environment. And again, you may or may not be able to mandate vaccinations. And people are still getting COVID with double vaccinations. But I want to be able to tell your story. We collect protocols. We collect waivers on the way in. We ask the 10 declaration questions. We sanitize the club. We have limited social distancing. And again, adhering to your provincial and territorial regulations is foundational to creating that safe environment and also implementing your own reasonable standards. Had several clients, particularly in Alberta, where the group gathering limits were much higher than people were comfortable with. And they ended up reducing the number of people in their facility till they felt comfortable that they can control the risk. So, this is going to come up in a waiver conversation, but we still have an obligation to provide a safe environment. So what will be considered reasonable will depend on the environment and the circumstances. And right now, the available case law on mandatory workplace vaccinations or mask wearing revolves around unionized workplaces and long-term healthcare, retirement homes. And we are seeing the courts are routinely upholding both vaccinations and mask mandates. But you can see the common sense argument to say, well, if I work in a high risk area to which I can expose people, it makes sense to do that. Does that same argument apply in a curling setting? To be honest with you, this is why I have difficulty with this presentation. The answer is maybe. We need more significant evidence to talk about the obligations of creating that safe environment and what's bona fide from a safety perspective to say yes or no. Some COVID considerations to consider when we talk about health and safety, and you can see I'm trying to help you start to put your story together. The existence of variants that spread more rapidly than the original strain. We still don't know how they react with the current vaccinations. COVID is transmissible by asymptomatic individuals, may go undetected. More rapid screening might be necessary to implement. The potential risk of COVID is highest when individuals are indoors within 2 meters of each other in a small space with limited ventilation. There's the sharing of equipment or food, taking deep breaths, shouting, exercising. All of these things resonate with the game of curling, right? We're indoors, we're close together, we're sweeping, we're throwing rocks, we're sharing possibly food, we're getting winded, we're exercising, and therefore there are a lot of substantive arguments to say, well, maybe this is a bona fide justification, but I still would like to have some medical expertise supporting that. Also, another issue to consider is maintaining the physical distance during recreational activities, and whether you're in a high contact sport, which of course poses a greater risk. So all of these points start helping you contemplate your story of what reasonable bona fide justification is with respect to mandatory vaccinations. Other things we want to look at. What's the individual's reason for refusing to get vaccinated? And I've spoke about this a little bit before. If it's a valid human rights ground, religious or health reasons, then we will have the ability to accommodate if possible. If their views are based on political or personal beliefs, that would be not sufficient to claim discrimination. So a court might ask you, what are the potential harms from COVID-19? And again, that goes back to that medical expertise of speaking about the contagion level in an ice setting in a closed indoor space. What evidence that there's effectiveness of vaccines in responding to those harms? How do we know it even prevents the transmission, particularly with the new strain? So again, you can see we're trying again to justify that bona fide justification. Is there evidence that mandatory vaccination is more effective than alternate health measures, wearing masks, social distancing, rapid testing that could be implemented? You can see that leads to the possible argument of accommodation. Can we do that? What are the costs to access vaccines? And again, some people may not have the same opportunities as other people. We do have to consider that. And that's why, again, I encourage you to be open-minded with your policies. And again, even though they may be black or white, we have to be open-minded to deal with the exceptions. Even if a mandatory vaccine is held to be bona fide, you would still have to show that it would be an undue hardship to make an accommodation. And that, I think, is something that's a little bit difficult to do when we take account all the safety regulations that we've already been using for the last 18 months. Yeah, start there, Danny.
Okay, I've just got a few other questions here I'd like to get in now. First one is, I am trying to draw a parallel of prohibiting non-vaxxed in a curling club to smokers in a restaurant given no smoking rules. Can you discuss?
Well, smoking is one not prohibited by human rights law. So, to implement a rule or a regulation that's not prohibited by human rights, or as we'll say shortly, privacy regulations, then it's a rule you can absolutely implement. So I can see why that you asked the question, but there is a distinction between the two. I go back to that human rights legislation test. Are we prohibiting? So why are we denying somebody the right to attend? Well, it might be because of a prohibited ground. Do we have an argument, a bona fide argument to prevent the offering of the service? And can we accommodate? And I think those are difficult answers to provide because we have been accommodating for the last 18 months. It may not be back to normal, but we may be able to still provide the services that were available. So that's, again, why I keep reiterating, stop, assess, make an informed decision.
Okay. Is obliging all other members to play at extra risk to their health really a reasonable accommodation, even with the mask and other limitations?
So, I guess I'd turn around and ask that question. What is the justification that to suggest that those people are at harm's length, are harmed, or could potentially be harmed? And I think we still are unsure of that answer. So I think that there's a lot of information that's available to us, but we're still making an assumption that we can't create a safe environment, and the only option is vaccinations. I don't think that's true.
Okay. And what you've spoken to so far, how would this apply to, it says junior curlers, but I'm assuming it's under the age of
Minors.
majority.
Well, it's a great question, Danny, because we're still not vaccinating people under 12. My parents live in Nova Scotia. I haven't seen them in over 2 years, and I can't get there because my kids would have to quarantine for 14 days to come to the province. So we have to contemplate what can we do to accommodate and to create that story of creating a safe environment when we know junior curlers under 12 cannot be vaccinated. To simply deny them the service would now likely fall under age discrimination. So it does go back to those same principles we spoke about before. Can we accommodate junior curlers and create a safe environment? I think the answer is yes.
Okay. Sorry, there's lots of questions.
It's great.
Under the requirement to treat all equally, if you don't require proof of vaccination for a different sport at your facility, for example, golf, can you mandate it for curling as it is indoors?
Yeah, and again, I know I'm repeating myself, Danny, but I think golf, for argument's sake, would have a very challenging time mandating mandatory vaccinations for people to attend golf. What's the transmission rate at golf in an outdoor sport where you can likely socially distance the whole time? I mean, I've played myself. There's barriers between the passengers and the golf cart. There's new contraptions in the hole, so you don't have to touch the ball or the flag. There's lots of ways to accommodate. So to suggest that we can compare golf to curling, the answer for me is absolutely not. So if there is, it's just different risk levels and different exposures. So I would say just because one may doesn't mean the other may not.
Okay, this is a good question. Does directors and officers insurance respond in human rights issues?
Normally, the answer is yes. I would tell all of you to speak to your broker about protection under COVID-related claims. Most insurers have excluded COVID-related protections. About a year ago, those have You who were lucky enough not to have your renewal occur may still have COVID-related protection, but I would say majority of you do not. So that's a question I think for your broker. Usually human rights complaints are protected under D&O insurance. I'm almost going to endeavor to say they may not be because of the COVID-related exclusion. Okay, so I want to get into the privacy issues, and as Kendall said, please jump in here. I'm not an expert in every province and territory on personal information and PIPA and Health Protection Acts, but there's an underlying assumption that involving the use of vaccine passport that individuals are required to disclose personal health information to access a program or facility. While there are benefits, there are significant legal issues that Kendall already addressed and we'll speak about again here. The use of a vaccination passport has the potential to encroach on the rights of participants, including substantial privacy concerns, particularly the asking, as well as the collection and storage of personal information. The type of information is deemed highly confidential and tightly regulated by provincial and federal and territorial legislation. So I would suggest all of you look into your Health Information Protection Act, one, to deem if you're even allowed to ask for health information. Majority of you likely would not be, as you're not deemed a medical care provider. You're a curling club. So different provinces have different legislation with respect to those queries. We could be discriminating against individuals who may have a valid reason for not being vaccinated or unable to receive the vaccination, including pre-existing medical conditions or religious beliefs, which we spoke about. And requiring individuals to prove they're fully vaccinated may expose an organization to legal liability, including the possibility of a human rights complaint, as well as a privacy issue. Privacy legislation prohibits a business from requiring an individual to consent to their use of their personal information as a condition of being a condition of providing a service. The generic rule is you provide personal information to a service provider to provide the service. If you're a truck delivery company and you're not willing to provide your address, I can't provide the service. I need a rationale for the reasonable person to determine the request of that information is valid. And you can see that this becomes a very hot topic about asking for someone's health information, and vaccination status could really expose you to a possible violation of privacy legislation. An organization does not want to consider requiring proof. It's critical to develop a clear protocol for freely obtaining the consent of the individual and securing confidential information. I'll say this now and I'll say it again. My philosophy on mandatory vaccinations is not to ask for them. My philosophy is here are the 20 related COVID protocols that we require for anybody to access our club. But if you wish to voluntarily disclose that you have been vaccinated, we can reduce those COVID-related protocols to not 20, but maybe to 5. That's my philosophy on the particular issue. But you have to be really careful. I wouldn't even ask if you are going to be asking for this information and you feel it's deemed legally valid. I would be just asking for proof and not maintaining a copy. Give it right back to them. Just jot down that you've received the information and give it back. That will eliminate a lot of the confidential information that you would be stuck with. So the big question, drum roll, can we ask our members to confirm their vaccination status? The short answer is yes, but only, and again, I apologize, this is a very legal thing to do, but maybe if applicable human rights and privacy obligations are considered and complied with. Alternate options is to indicate all required COVID-related protocols, but if the person voluntarily provides their status, those requirements can be minimized. Clubs should carefully consider their options for members protected by human rights and privacy legislation and look at alternate ways of providing services. And if you do collect and your legislation allows you to ask the question, it would be prudent to provide members notice and explain the purpose to which the information is being collected. Excuse me. And a little bit, one final point, health and safety procedures may not be sufficient if other measures that do not require the collection of personal information could be as effective. So again, I go back to that justification. What's our bona fide reason for asking for double vaccination? We need substantive bona fide evidence to support that. If physical distancing and masking and cleanliness is an alternate solution, you may not be found to have bona fide justification for mandating what you're requesting. Some of the best practices: carefully assess all available accommodation measures. Consider alternate ways that your business might provide goods or services to unvaccinated customers in a manner that addresses safety concerns. Conduct an objective assessment of COVID-19 transmission risk associated with member contact, and determine whether there's reasonable purpose for collecting proof of vaccination. If we can create a safe environment through alternate means, we may not have bona fide justification. Prepare a clear statement for customers, for members. Notify them the purpose for which you may require vaccination proof. And where appropriate, again, be very open-minded to that accommodation request. You will get one. I almost promise you, you will get one. Stop, give yourself some time to assess the situation, and then make a decision. Designate only a few people who are trained to collect vaccination status information. Try and limit the disclosure, again, if your privacy legislation allows it. And consider only requesting a view of proof of vaccination without recording it. Make sure, of course, that information is securely stored and not accessible to the public. So Danny, I'm gonna before I get into these, see if there's any other questions on the chat box, and then we'll go through the questions that came in early.
Let's do the questions. Let's do the questions that came in early, and then I got to filter through some of the chat room questions because some of them are medical, which I will forward on to our chief medical officer. And I'll go through some others, and there's some others that will just provide a written response in the next couple of days. So
Okay,
let's
great.
go with your questions. The questions
Are we allowed to only allow double vaccinated participants in my club? As you heard from the last 45 minutes, the answer is maybe. Again, whether your privacy legislation and well as your human rights legislation allow you to do that. Again, I would look at assessing the risk level of COVID transmission in your club, and then based on that assessment, we would make a determination on the proper protocols to implement. Are we able to require vaccination of members and guests only in periods of high cases, measures, or allowed to make that a full-time requirement? Again, I wouldn't distinguish between certain periods of transmission rates. I would say that's something that's going to be a bit irrelevant with respect to as everything else we've spoken about. Obviously, if we're in a higher transmission and the numbers are higher, maybe there is more bona fide justification to ask that query, but I would not base that on a determination of asking for mandatory vaccinations. Is it necessary to have our members complete a COVID declaration waiver? I say absolutely yes. I do not think we're out of the woods. I think we're close to being out of the woods, but I would say that currently in the current environment, we continue to ask for our declarations. We continue to ask for waivers to be signed to protect the integrity and the risk of the association. I think it would be still valid to do so, yes. Are the laws consistent across each province and territory? Absolutely not. Each province and territory particularly would have its own human rights code, as well as some provinces and territory have their own privacy legislation on top of PIPEDA, which would be the federal legislation. In addition, another piece of legislation we'd want to consider would be, again, the request for health information, and that usually falls under the Health Information Protection Act or some sort of similar name within your province or territory. So you can see from the very first slide I provided to you, provinces are managing this differently. through their governments. And I would suggest before making a decision, again, do a little homework on your provincial or territorial applicable legislation. Can clubs require proof of vaccination to participate? For what ages? What about guests? Again, I'm going to go back to the answer of maybe. I think you have to do your assessment and determine whether it's valid, whether it's bona fide to ask for vaccination information. Can clubs insist staff be vaccinated? How can this information be collected and stored? Again, I always want to keep giving the caveat of applicable legislation, so please take these answers with an asterisk. Can clubs ask staff to be vaccinated? The answer is, again, maybe, depending on the risk that they would expose. I can tell you that most employers have the ability to accommodate their staff by allowing them to work from home or to work within a closed door office by themselves. So to insist that they be vaccinated, the answer is likely no. But again, where we're seeing some of the case law come out is on those long-term health cares or medical practice is where the answer is yes, because it's validated by bona fide justification to do so. Can we run double vaccinated leagues only? Again, I think you have to be careful. Again, here is that, why would we be preventing somebody from playing? What's the reason they can't be vaccinated? So I do think that you have to be able to answer that query and allow for a potential accommodation for those who aren't vaccinated, who are protected, again, by a prohibited ground under the Human Rights Code. Is there a difference between private and public curling clubs? Yes, but I do think you have to be really careful when you talk about the difference between how we treat people in a private or public curling club. What happens in a private setting is we still have to treat everybody within that private club the same. So to mandate that everybody be double vaccinated within that private club, I still think that you would be subject to potential human rights complaint based on the fact that you're not treating everybody within that private club equally. Can we make proof of vaccination a condition of membership or entry into the club for non-members? Proof of medical exemption. Again, you have to be really careful here, asking for medical information. And is there bona fide justification to ask that question? Can we use the following on registration? I have been vaccinated. I have a medical exemption. I do not intend to get vaccinated. I'd rather keep my vaccination status private. I think you can include that on your registration form. I think it would be very important to indicate that filling out that section is optional. It's not a mandation. It's optional. And again, that goes back to requesting medical information from an individual. What's the recommendation for curlers under 12? I would be implementing the standard COVID-related protocols that we've been using the last 18 months to create that safe environment. I don't think you can preclude them from accessing your services simply because they have no access to vaccinations. What are the legal implications of having members self-declare? They are vaccinated versus a vaccination passport? I think to draw a distinction is people are volunteering their information rather than we're mandating their information. And again, I think that's why I liked the philosophy that I had proposed, was to say, here's our return to play protocols. And if you don't wish to adhere to them and you wish to voluntarily disclose your vaccination status, we can reduce those numbers. What are the liability issues if members are required to be vaccinated, but outside rentals are not? Liability is a very, very broad topic. The liability, to be honest with you, regardless of vaccination status, it's a mandate of an owner, of a service provider, to provide a safe environment. And that safe environment may vary depending on the circumstances. So I don't draw a distinction between outside rentals and members. I think the liability is the same with respect to COVID-related protocols.
Can you go back to 13?
Oh yeah, good one. Sorry, Danny. How long should a club keep waivers and declaration forms? Waivers, unfortunately, I would say keep them forever. The most statutes of limitations on litigation claims are from the date of discovery of the injury, not necessarily the date the injury occurred. So I would recommend scanning them and keep them on a PDF file and keep them as long as they're necessary. The declaration forms, again, the simple, easy answer is keep them forever. I do know there are government regulations. I believe here in Ontario, they have to be kept for 30 days. But in the current environment, I wouldn't be running to destroy them. I think particularly in today's technology, scan it and keep it. Can we have different rules for golfers and curlers? Absolutely. I think you can. I think the risk level is different between an outside activity and an inside activity. But again, those different rules have to be reasonable based on reliable evidence. Is there a difference between each province and territory? Again, absolutely, depending on the applicable legislation and the way government is mandating or implementing different rules. All right, Danny, what else you got?
There's lots of questions here, so I'm going to briefly, I'll go through them one at a time, and I'll pass over the ones that are medically related, and I will send those on to Dr. Bob McCormick, who's our chief medical officer, to get answers to those medical questions. And there's some others that are, I think, a little more complicated that we'll leave to just publish as a written reply to the question. So there's lots here. I'll just start going through a few of them briefly. So sample wording of questions, forms, declarations. We have all that stuff prepared. The waivers and the declaration forms as part of our return to play document that will be published soon as this vaccination passport opinion gets finalized in that document. So hopefully in the next couple of days. So should we have a different waiver for non-vaccinated members asking them to assume the extra risk to their health?
No. No. The answer is the risk of COVID is reduced if you're vaccinated, but of course it's not. You still may get it. We're seeing that with the people at the Olympics who have received it, who are double vaccinated. I would not change the waiver with respect to whether you're vaccinated or not. The risk of getting COVID still exists, so I wouldn't change it at all.
Okay. Back to the staff question. There was a good point made. The most of curling club staff can't work from home. They need to be on site. So can management or the board of directors insist that staff be vaccinated?
Again, the answer, Danny, unfortunately, is maybe. It depends on whether they have the ability to accommodate. They have the ability to provide them to be able to work in an environment. Maybe there are mechanisms that the ice technician will be on the ice by themselves and they won't be near somebody else. They can mask, they can socially distance. There's lots of different things. So is it black and white? Yes, no, vaccinated? I would say absolutely not. And again, that's why each case is dealt with on a specific basis.
Okay. If we start asking for proof of double vaccination for COVID, where do we start, and what happens with other communicable diseases, influenza, measles, mumps, etc.?
Well, that's a really great question and a great point. For the last 100 years of existence, we've never asked for that kind of information when we register for a sporting activity. And of course, coming out of a pandemic and all of us being arguably locked in our homes for the last 18 months, I can see the reason why we're asking now. But to suggest that we're going to open that, to suggest that we're going to be asking these questions in perpetuity, I sure as hell hope not. And to suggest that we're going to open that even to a broader questionnaire of do you have chickenpox vaccinations and measles and mumps, I think the answer is absolutely not, Danny.
Okay. I think you answered this, but I don't remember. So I'm going to ask it again or read it out. COVID protocols were the reduction in protocols with proof of vaccination. Would this only be applicable if all members provided proof of vaccine? If a small group of members refused to provide proof, then the extended protocols would apply to all or just them?
Well, what we're seeing happen right now is those protocols would just apply to them. So we're seeing people with vaccinations not being required to mask, not being required to socially distance. And again, those who do not wish to disclose that information. Again, a lot of what we're seeing is coming from the United States, which of course is its own set of legislation. But I just read an article in the NFL where, again, players who are not vaccinated are being treated very differently. And so within Canada, can we have reduced protocols for vaccinated? I'd say yes. And those who do not wish to disclose that information, they would still be required to adhere to those, those 10 to 20 guidelines.
Okay. Is the request from unvaccinated participants to supply a valid PCR test prior to attending the club each time a legal issue?
It's again a potential legal issue. I can tell you that I think it's reasonable to ask for. Again, you have to deal with them on a case by case basis. That if somebody declines to take that rapid test, why? What's the reason for declining? And if it's protected by human rights legislation, then we'd have to probably accommodate, and we'd have to figure out what that looks like. Hence, again, my repeating of when you get positioned with a question like that, stop, get information, assess, then make an answer.
This is, I think, a good question, and one that I would ask as well, because it's already been mentioned that every province and territory have different rules, etc. So, what should a curling club in any province? What would their next step be, other than using some of the guidelines that we're going to prepare that are global? What should their next step be in their province or territory?
So Danny, so after they create their, let's call it 10 to 20 rules of return to curling in a COVID environment, what would their next step be? Educate their members, let them know the protocols you're putting in place to create a safe environment. You may wish to allow for the voluntary disclosure of vaccinations. If so, what would that mean from a safety protocol perspective? And again, I know I'm repeating myself, but again, if your legislation allows you to ask that question, okay?
Okay, so what would they need some kind of validation or ratification if they decide to implement some policy? Like if they decide to do nothing, that's obviously an issue that they deal with internally. But do they need somebody to say yes, this is good?
On
Their
the
own
COVID,
lawyer, their own lawyer, their
on the protocols.
protocols, and any policy that they develop in terms of vaccinated versus unvaccinated.
Yeah, I would very much advocate for having somebody look that over. Again, there's multiple different facets, and each province and territory has different regulations on return to play protocols. I mean, here in Ontario, we weren't allowed to do anything until mid-June. I mean, we were shut down January almost till mid-June. I know different provinces opened up on quicker schemes, and again, there's different provincial legislation that's going to be very applicable, particularly asking about vaccinations.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. Does occupational health and safety come into play?
Yeah, absolutely. Good question. So a lot of the requests, a lot of the conversation is, double vaccination, or can we ask for vaccinations from members? Most occupational health and safety legislation requires the employer to create a safe environment for its workers. So again, what does that look like? And can we create a safe environment for our workers? And again, each one of those will be done on a case by case basis, depending on the type of work that's being undertaken, as well as our ability to accommodate. So you might want to do a workplace assessment looking at return to work protocols. And I would be surprised to suggest that the occupational health and safety boards in each province or territory have likely already created some sort of questionnaire or survey that you can take.
Okay. Would it be beneficial to survey the membership on what they feel is safe to return?
I don't think so. I think the reason I say that is because depending on the results, they may not be to your liking, or they may not be in compliance with legal obligations. So it's very possible your members say X and you're mandated to do Y, and then you have to answer why you didn't do X. So I wouldn't probably do that. I think you do a legal and medical assessment on how to open safely, and what you can and cannot ask, and go from there.
I got one on my email here. Would You'd like to know how many successful human right code complaints have there been against school boards who for decades have required proof of vaccination as a condition of attending school?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I will say that I did read an article preparing for tonight, that particular topic is absolutely a hot one, and particularly with respect to COVID vaccines and teachers returning to work and students coming back. And again, each province is dealing with it a bit differently. but the argument was that there was reasonable bona fide justification to ask that question when you're talking about, young kids in a small situation with likely pretty crappy air quality. So there was, in certain cases, there was justification to say they could ask that based on the medical assessment in the environment.
Okay, I think you answered this one, but it'd be good to hear it again. If the club chooses to follow COVID rules issued by the provincial authority, can we assume that that removes the risk associated to the club if it's mandated from a government above us that says you must do this?
Yeah, look, I mean, absolutely, Danny. I think, when I talk about risk management and liability in a COVID environment, the fundamental rule is you have to adhere to your government regulations. That is the basement approach. That is the must do's. And then there's the we'd like to do's, meaning we create a higher standard. That's more subjective. And as I said before, I've seen organizations follow their provincial regulations, their provincial regulations allow them to go, let's say, a group of 50. Or I've had organizations say, well, we don't feel comfortable. We don't feel comfortable with respect to opening that largely. So I think you can use your own interpretation if you want to make more restrictive requirements, but at minimum, you have to comply with government regulations. That's a no-brainer.
Is it your opinion that we should not ask for double vaccination or proof of double vaccination and just use the safety protocols that clubs put in place last year?
Yeah, that's the simplest approach, Danny, without doing, research on legislation. I think that's the simplest approach. And like I said before, voluntary disclosure of vaccinations is likely a better approach than asking for it. So I do like that approach for sure. Here's our 20 related COVID protocols, but if you voluntarily disclose your vaccination status, we can minimize some of those requirements.
Okay. Here's a question that I would ask because I would like to know, be able to provide an answer to a member. So assuming our club chooses a path to allow non-vaxxed players or vax players to play because we hope to create a safe environment, how do we reply to a vaccinated member who feels that the club's ability to create a safe environment is not sufficient?
Well, I think two things there, Danny. One, I think you would have to address the obligations that the club has under law. And number two, I think it would be really important to communicate all the things, the great things the club is doing to create that safe environment. So, again, what are those 20 protocols that are being implemented to create a safe environment? And again, we've been doing them for the last 18 months. So I don't think there's going to be significant changes from a duty of care perspective, a standard of care perspective. It's whether we can ease those restrictions based on government regulations and or based on voluntary disclosure of vaccinations.
Okay, they're still rolling in here. In Alberta Health Services has removed all restrictions around COVID, including mask mandates and gathering sizes, both indoors and outdoors. How does this affect our club regulations and protocols?
Well, again, so if there are no regulations in Alberta with respect to COVID from a risk management perspective, I mean, that's great from a liability standpoint. The bar, I would say, is relatively low with respect to creating a safe environment. It would then be up to the club on whether or not they want to increase that standard to provide more due diligence on a COVID-related protocol. Again, I've seen it happen. Yes, you're going to get lots of kickback, and sometimes people are their worst enemies. So you have to make an informed decision on whether it's validated to increase the protocols. I'm trying to, Danny, to scroll through some of the questions here, and I think somebody had mentioned that there was a report done in the U.S. about the transmissions of COVID in a curling environment, and it may be worthwhile looking at that, even though Alberta has said you don't have to do anything.
What about precedent from other organizations? The Winnipeg Blue Bombers will only allow fully vaccinated fans to attend live games. Thus, curling clubs could have the same requirement?
Yeah, I mean, short answer is yes, but again, it has to be justified. I mean, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, they may be saying everybody has to be fully vaccinated. When you're sitting in a stadium, you're on top of each other, and then the risk of transmission becomes higher. Therefore, they feel they have justifications to mandate vaccinations. Can we make that same argument in a curling environment? I think the answer is likely yes, but I think you have to at least support that or have some medical evidence to suggest that's correct.
A bunch of questions on voluntary disclosure. I don't know, you can see them, can't you?
I can see some of them.
Go to the bottom and then start from there and see what we should be answering and or
Yeah,
publishing.
so say Bob refuses to disclose status. If Bob refuses to disclose his status, then again, I think depending on the philosophy of the club, and again, if you're going with the come into the club, here's the 20, required guidelines. If they don't want to disclose, then they're still required to oblige with those 20 guidelines. If they wish to disclose, then maybe we can minimize those restrictions. But I think you have to be, again, really careful on the mandation of asking that query. Um, you know, I've had a lot of time to think about these questions, and probably I get 5 or 6 of them a day. Just repeat, repeat, repeat. Can we do this? Can we do this? And again, I think the answer is again applicable legislation, relevant. Um, yeah, you can do it, but you better be prepared to defend it. And what does that mean? So, can I justify asking for health information? Can I justify prohibiting a service based in the current environment? And I need to have an answer. And if I say I don't know or it's safety, it's not enough. I want to be able to tell my story when I'm asked in front of a judge or an arbitration panel to justify it.
Our the Take a look at the very last one.
I see it, Danny. Our
Yeah.
members or participants, if they don't get vaccinated, willingly spread the virus, ultimately cause an outbreak. Could a club sue a member for their actions? I mean, short answer is yes. I mean, to sue somebody is as simple as walking to the courthouse, paying the filing fee. Will you be successful in your litigation? That's a whole other, you'd have to prove that probably the person had knowledge and had intent, and was negligent in their conduct. So I think it would really depend on the facts on whether you'd be successful on a litigation claim against a member.
Is it acceptable to have a policy requiring those who qualify for vaccination be fully vaccinated in order to curl without ever asking for individual proof or certification?
Well, it's a lot of trust on the member, that's for sure. Again, if you're going to mandate it and your legislation allows for it, I would ask for it.
So there's a ton of questions on disclosure and stuff like that. So I think we'll publish something.
Yeah, there's a couple hands up, Danny. I see Rich
Oh,
and Rod have been waiting very patiently.
oh, sorry, I was just staring at the bottom.
Rod, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yep. So my question is the whole reasoning or part of the reasoning behind vaccination was to protect ourselves from getting the COVID virus. Therefore, what is the ramifications on that for people that are unvaccinated? We've already taken our safety protocols. We've gotten vaccinated. So how does that play out into whether you might be able to do anything with unvaccinated?
Well, I'd almost reverse the question, Rod. I think, as a provider of services, we still have an obligation to create a safe environment for those who are unvaccinated. And I think that's why it's important that we still maintain those protocols, again, those reasonable protocols. And what's reasonable will depend on each province and your COVID related numbers as well as the government regulations. But I do think we have an obligation to create a safe environment for unvaccinated people as well. So I may have answered your question backwards, but I hope I answered it.
This is a question more towards me. Will the provincial curling authorities be offering guidance to their curling clubs? Absolutely. We will work with our member associations to identify um, those concepts or issues that are specific to one particular region. and supply that information to those club members, to those member clubs. So there's like a ton of voluntary, the disclosure stuff. So we'll write a piece on that and supply it to you in writing.
There's another hand up, Danny.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, this is hard to type this question out, so I thought I would ask it vocally. A lot of what we're thinking is a lot of the people that are returning to play that are double vaccinated might be a little scared or worried if we allow non-vaccinated people to join them at the rink. Would it be beneficial to have some kind of statement or communication, maybe from the local health authority, stating that people that are double vaccinated can feel less threatened in a sporting environment than those vaccinated? So encouraging, a healthy lifestyle. I don't know. I guess that's the big fear in our curling center, is that vaccinated people are going to be afraid to come back if they know we're opening it up to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I love education, Pat, and communication. I think if you've got something from your health authority to describe, the risks and the non-risks and the educational piece, I think is huge value. I think we all have questions, and what does vaccinated even mean, and does it protect me, and what about the variant, and you can still get it but you won't show symptoms. I'm just rattling off stuff off the top of my head. So love that idea of education. I think it's super valid for sure, to try and give as much information to allow people to make informed decisions on whether or not they want to come back to the club.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see anything new or unique in here at this point, but we will certainly cover everything off in our published document. There was one question right at the start asked for in French, and it was about the COVID declaration, whether we should be putting it in place. So we answered that one, yes. And those forms will be supplied to everybody through the provincial and territorial associations later this week.
In closing, Danny, I do want to, apologize. I do recognize this is not a simple yes, no answer, and particularly when we start talking about different provinces and territories and regulations and legislation and privacy concerns and human rights concerns. I really appreciate that, and I apologize for the lack of clarity, but that's the reality of the situation until, which likely won't happen, that government comes out and provides direction. We do kind of end up with this interpretation. I did ample research in preparation for tonight to look at what's happening across the country in Canadian law and case law, and I would just routinely saw the same information being republished on doing assessments, looking at bona fide justification. Can we accommodate? What does privacy legislation say? So I do apologize. I know it's not a clear, concise answer. I hope you did learn a little bit of something tonight. If you are going to remember anything, it's don't make a quick answer. Wait, get information, make an informed decision, because I think saying something rapidly is really what leads you to potential problems. So if you're unsure, reach out to Danny. You can reach out to me. We can find someone to help you out in your province or territory. No problem.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Steven. Much appreciated, as usual. I think we created ourselves more work tonight than we anticipated, but it's great. There was a fantastic array of questions, and there's a lot of concern out there from our current clubs about how they're going to approach this in the coming months. And hopefully we will have something prepared for you by the end of the week, so you can begin that process. I don't envy any of you to have to go through this. Hopefully it will be easy, and we'll be back to normal by sometime in September. So on behalf of Curling Canada, thank you, Steven, very much for working with us tonight. Marc-Andre, you didn't get to translate any questions or answers, but thank you for being on board, and thank you to everybody that was on the call today. Good luck with your plans for reopening. And please, whenever something great happens at your club, post it on Facebook or Twitter or any other social media so that we can share it with everybody and get everybody pumped up about curling, starting as early as next week in some places. Thank you. Good night, everybody.